Welcome to War, Revolutions and Terror. In my last lecture, I finished up with the French Revolution. I was very aware that afterwards, at least, that I could have perhaps spent more time talking not only about the tumult and chaos, which I think you got a sense of during that lecture, but also the way in which the entire society had become so politicized that during the Reign of Terror, for example, it was not only the crowd that was being mobilized at different times to act as a kind of impetus of the revolution, but also the sheer amount of denunciation, rumor, payback, revenge that was occurring throughout the revolution really contributed to the terror and to that particular phase of the revolution. Now, as we move on to the Russian Revolution, this week I'm going to really focus upon a whole set of ideas, and particularly ideas around socialism and communism, that would be of enormous importance to laying out the frame of reference by which the intelligentsia, and as I will emphasize throughout the telling the story of the Russian Revolution, the intelligentsia play a huge role in that revolution. And as we will see later, that this is something I'll touch on over the next week and the week after, we will see that unlike the French Revolution, the class of the intelligentsia was already revolutionary prior to the revolution. And again, if we think back about the French Revolution, although there had been the Enlightenment and the philosophes providing a whole set of ideas that would be, especially the ideas of people like Rousseau, to some extent Montesquieu, and various others that would play into the revolution, it wasn't the case, as will be the case with the Russian Revolution, that there was a fully thought out program prior to the revolution. But that was modulated, and this is what I will bring up in the next couple of weeks, by a whole set of particular inflections that formed how these ideas coming out of Western Europe would feed into Russia. But ultimately, these ideas are intrinsic to the way in which the intelligentsia, when combined with its particular view of the peasantry and its particular role within the populist, in developing populist ideals, would ultimately be modulated by the ideas of Marxism. But to understand Marxism, we have to understand a number of other preconditions for the possibility of Marxism. And perhaps the most important of these, and this does come out of the Enlightenment also, is the way in which ideas play a defining role. So not just circumstances, but the development of an ideational array of ideas, which we will then come to call ideology, dictate the parameters around which the aspirants of change, that is to say, primarily the intelligentsia in Russia, and we'll see the huge role that they play in the Russian Revolution and to the lead up of the Russian Revolution. But of course, that could only have impact because of all sorts of other social conditions which also modulate and inflect the way in which these ideas take shape. Now, I just mentioned the word ideology. That's a term that becomes very commonplace in the 19th century and especially in the 20th century. And those of you that might have done international politics or are aware of the history of the 20th century will be aware that the Second World War was very much an ideological war. And you might also remember me saying in an earlier lecture that the French Revolution contained in embryo not only the deployment of the masses for political organisation, even though it was really the urban masses, and that won't be, in some ways, it's going to be similar to what takes place in the Russian Revolution, but also the ideas that are seen as galvanizing and being supportive of the masses, and the three major ideologies that engage in this conflict for hegemony or supremacy throughout the Second World War: fascism, socialism, and liberal democracy, or socialism, communism in the case of the Soviets. But these all have their roots in the 19th century, although fascism as such will only be fully formed as an ideology in the 20th century, whereas liberal democracy or liberalism and communism are very much rooted in the 19th century. But as I also said, even fascism, the idea of the militarization, the politicization in terms of a military hierarchy that's so important to fascism, that too comes out of the French Revolution, and especially in the Napoleonic phase, you could say, where basically you have a strong leader, even though there are obvious differences, important differences between Napoleon and what would take place within fascism. But also, fascism would not have been possible in many ways without socialism itself, even though it becomes a national form of socialism. Okay, so ideas are going to play a very important role, and I'll just go back one step also and say this about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is very much something formed along the lines of, or something created along the lines of, to use a phrase that Locke first formulated, so an important founder of liberal theory, and which Thomas Reid, a Scottish philosopher who's critical of this, and Thomas Reid develops a common sense philosophy. He talks about philosophy being grounded in the way of ideas, and he actually traces this way back to the ancients. But this idea of there being a way, or the way of ideas, really takes on importance when we can see that just as the Enlightenment had hoped to ensure that all political authority is legitimated on the basis of the rationality of its programs, that rationality has to be cashed out in terms of ideas. So, to sum this up, the point I'm wanting to make here is ideologies, which will be the array of ideas that are deployed in world making, that is, to try and make the world, which is really the result of a whole slew of historical contingencies. Again, that's something I emphasized in those early lectures, and I will be emphasizing this again when we look at the conditions of Russia. Nevertheless, once the intelligentsia start to play a role as trying to provide a program for the future, a way of shaping social relationships to fit their ideas, that is, their rational understanding, to some extent their principles and or models, I'm using that in quite a loose sense, that in a way that's not too dissimilar from the kind of modeling that takes place in the experimental sciences, which is part of the scientific revolution, and the new metaphysics more generally, which we find goes really first articulated in its full-blown vision in Descartes. We'll see that ideas are really, really going to be what matters. And this is a very different way of doing business, even though to some extent we could say that the precursor of this are the doctrinal disputes that take place within Christendom. But they do take on a very different hue when the kind of mythical or magical, and that's how it is seen by the enlightened thinkers, interpretation of contingencies that are part of religion are dispensed with, and we now are attempting to, or these people are attempting to, provide an overview of society a view of society based on the coherence of its ideas. Now, this is going to be really important because at one level, what we're talking about is political rationalism. And that's a phrase that a very important 20th century, somewhat conservative political theorist called Michael Oakeshott had identified. And I think that's a great insight of Oakeshott, even though other thinkers before him are already aware of this kind of problem. And it will be a problem. So another thing that I'll be doing today, when I look at Marx, especially, is I will be talking about some of the theoretical problems of Marxism. Because one of the things with any kind of idealist, and that is also ideological understanding of the real, is if you make a fundamental judgment error in one of the key ideas that you're deploying to make sense of the real and that's going to be intrinsic to your program about how society should operate, inevitably these errors, these mistakes that simply come from the limits of human understanding, these are going to have a tremendous impact. And in this respect, the point I'm wanting to make, and we will see this in the Russian Revolution, is that there are fundamental flaws at the very basis of the socialist and communist ideas that occur in the Marxian inflection. That's quite different from the more social democratic project, which also goes back to the socialism, which is much more pragmatic, much less ideological in the strict sense. That is, it's much more open to the contingencies and much more willing to try and do a deal with the reality around it, rather than an attempt to impose an ideological program upon the reality when the reality doesn't really fit what the model has said about it. So that's going to be very important. In this sense, I am going to be implying here that there was something about the program of the way in which the Russian Revolution developed. Particularly, you will recall that, well, as I will bring out, you could say there's two phases of the Russian Revolution: the so-called February Revolution and the so-called, which involves the abdication of the Tsar and the entrenchment of power of a provisional government, which has been installed in the Duma, a kind of legislative body that did not have the kind of power that a normal government, a normal parliamentary system would have, but became the next best thing, the possibility that you could have in Russia. And then the breakdown of that with the October Revolution, which is basically, as we will see, a coup that's built around a program, and that program ultimately is an admixture of things that are very important to Marx and Lenin, but also come out of the Russian experience and give that program a special direction. And as we will see, the scale of mass murder in that revolution absolutely leaves in the shade what has occurred in the French Revolution. Though, as I say that, if we take the Napoleonic Wars and the Napoleonic conquest as in some important ways as they are, and as I did mention in the lectures, a continuation of the revolution, then the scale of numbers of dead coming out of the French Revolution rise considerably. But if we're thinking purely domestically, that is, when we're looking at the Russian Revolution, what takes place within what will become the Soviet Union, we'll see that the scale of death is really quite massive. And that has a lot to do with the ideology, not just the personalities of Stalin or Lenin, but the actual ideology that if you want to institute this program, and you're still going to have to deal with the contingencies which create all these conditions which you haven't thought about when drawing up the program, inevitably you're going to have conflict on a scale which will require that if you want to save the revolution, you're going to have to kill a lot of people. And so that, in that sense, is a line of continuity. I will come back to that when I start moving closer to the Russian Revolution at the end of this lecture, hopefully. And I will talk about certain myths that have occurred within the telling of the story of the Russian Revolution. Those myths are less accepted by historians now, but there are still some that ultimately position themselves as players, as supporters of what the revolution stood for. And so they tend to see the revolution through a certain set of parameters that are ideological. Okay. I want to say from the outset that I am very skeptical of what an ideology can do. And the reason for that is I think that the historical circumstances and the particular contingencies of group behavior, group reactions are such that our understanding of that is always going to be very limited. So I'll put on the table that I think ultimately it's pragmatics that lead you to have a better understanding of what is going on rather than ideology. And again, so for a certain group of people, that will already mean that I am ideologically opposed to what the revolution was standing for, when I would just say I'm opposed to any kind of ideology. Now, one of the things, though, about ideological thinking is it tends to group things in such a way that it's impossible, according to that way of thinking, for anyone not to be involved in some set of ideological commitments. I think that is, again, playing in to a certain philosophical stance, which I think is disputable. And in a book that I wrote that came out at the end of last year called Idolizing the Idea, A Critical History of Modern Philosophy, I really did a very extended critique of that position. And as I was doing it, it also ended up being a critique of modern philosophy more generally. And that is to say, I think philosophy can only capture so much of reality. But what we will see with the ideologies, especially of socialism, communism, this is also true to an important extent of liberalism for various reasons, which I won't go into now. It's somewhat less true of conservatism, because conservatism tends to be more reacting to other ideological programs, and in its reaction to that, it tends to look to tradition in the past to make its criticism, rather than the coherence and quality of its ideas, which in some ways is why conservative thinkers can be often seen as less satisfying philosophically because of the ideas that they're working with, because the ideas that they're working with are largely framed around contingency and tradition rather than rational coherence of the group of ideas. Now, the word ideology, which, so you can see the word there, you can see two words in that word. You can see the word ideas, and that is a Platonic coinage, so that word first comes into play very early in the history of philosophy, and the word logos, which again in Plato's work, the word logos meant reason or argument, and putting things together that fit together in relationship to the idea which the philosophical mind is accessing through the philosophical method. Now, of course, there's going to be a huge amount of differences between ancient philosophy and modern philosophy, and in which the way ideas are identified, in which the way they're even defined. But nevertheless, there is that kind of continuity. So there's a certain continuity. And we will also recall that Plato is one of the first to lay down a program of an ideal state, which is, he says, is nowhere, a utopia. And we will be seeing that some of the earliest socialists and they tend to be heavily criticized by Marx and Engels, especially, but not only in the Communist Manifesto. They are called utopians. And for Marx, that's a criticism because, as we'll see, Marx believes he has a scientific set of ideas at his disposal and not just the utopian set of ideas. So he believes that there's something about reality that he's divine through deploying a certain method that enters into the workings of history itself and the history of social formation. And ultimately, that will lead to a certain kind of solution to social conflict. I'll come back to that. So that's the word ideology. It was originally coined, so no one had used this word ideology until Destutt de Tracy came along. Marx, by the way, was no fan of Destutt de Tracy. He mentions them once or twice, but he's very critical of them. And one of the reasons he's so critical of him is that de Tracy was a political economist, and indeed Thomas Jefferson, who you will recall not only was an important player in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and an important player in the American War of Independence, who was at one stage a president, but also had also gone to France and was really excited by the revolution in France. And he had translated de Tracy's treatise on political economy. And the treatise on political economy is essentially a kind of what we would call a liberal account, that is taking into account the importance of initiative, free trade, private capital, and such like. De Tracy's admirers also would include one of the leading members of the Decembrist movement, which I will talk about later, because the Decembrist movement is a really important early revolutionary group that transpires within the army in the 19th century, and that they are going to play a very important role. So for de Tracy, ideologists, and Napoleon actually also at one point just shakes his head and basically condemns the ideologists. He thinks that they're crazy. But de Tracy, anyway, says the ideologists, they devoted their understanding to the formation of ideas for the study of humankind and recognizing the importance of political economy. So the word ideology, when it's first used, is very much bound up with this idea of political, or the practice of political economy. And political economy, it had really emerged as a full-blown science, even though there have been all sorts of antecedents, including Locke. It can be seen as an antecedent of political economy, but it's really with Adam Smith that the discipline, and his book, The Wealth of Nations, the discipline of economics emerges fully formed. There were other people working on economics, but the first full-blown theory that's in a sense is quite satisfying in some ways. I'm not saying there can't be criticisms, but is Adam Smith. Now, the original ideologists, like Smith, were liberal. And Tracy was anti-socialist and anti-communist to the extent that socialist and communist ideas were in the ears. And it was largely laissez-faire. And the basis of political economy revolves around the idea of classes and the division of labor and how classes contribute to production. And the question of the economist is how to maximize levels of production and ultimately levels of wealth within a country. So Tracy's ideas are still very much in the liberal mode, which is one of the reasons Marx would be so critical of him. One of the other things that transpires, and this also begins with Smith, is that productivity is no longer seen as it was by the earlier economists, and because it was so, was one of the problems with them, and why in many ways their contribution to economics was very limited, because they basically saw the land as the primary source of value. So land and land ownership were what mattered. But obviously, once you've got more merchants, as factories are starting to emerge, and remember, there were some factories during the time of the French Revolution, but they shouldn't be confused with what takes place from the middle of the 19th century. And it's Marx is writing as this is occurring when the Industrial Revolution really kicks in. So we might say that the Industrial Revolution begins with the development of the steam engine, and the size of factories starts to grow, and the transportation of goods increases. But with the Industrial Revolution, we see not only larger scale industry, and again intensifying the role of classes with capital, with investment property, plus bringing into play now a whole new set of a labouring class that is now working in the cities, and not just part of an agrarian workforce that drifts into town to do some work there, or starts drifting into the cities and working for different artisans and occasionally in the factory. But we start to see that they play a definitive role in the social composition. So they start to play an important, well, I say definitive, it depends where you are. Certainly in the United Kingdom, which is where Marx will be living after he leaves Germany, and having spent some time in France where he picks up ideas about socialism there, you now have the greatest industrial power on earth at this stage. And that industry is also being fed by science. So all sorts of scientific developments in technology are starting to occur. So some of this is taking place after De Tracy, or kind of contemporaneous with De Tracy, but it takes on a much greater importance a little later. It's starting to do so before he dies. Now, the other thing I should just mention about De Tracy, and this is really a biographical material, is that he had been a deputy of the Bourbonnais nobility in 1789. During the Revolution, he had supported the abolition of the nobles, supported the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He was supportive of the civil constitution of the clergy. So it's a good example of an aristocrat who basically then aligns himself with the program of the revolution. But the Jacobins mistrusted him. Another thing about the Jacobins is there was a big internal struggle going on between those that were, and to some extent this involves the Jacobin dispute with the Gironde, the extent to which the merchant classes tended to be, not completely, but tended to side more with the Gironde than the Jacobins. You will recall also in the revolution that the Gironde was seen as indulgence, as the word was called, or moderates, as the word was called, and that was used in a very abusive sense in the French Revolution. That meant ultimately that you were not really fully lockstep with the revolution itself. But even within the Jacobins, those that wanted to be more socialistic and more communistic, as opposed to those that were more supportive of smaller plots of private property, there tended to be a dispute around that. And the more radical group, if we're to use that term, would really be amongst the enragés, a number of whom were executed by the Jacobins, and Hebert, who was a Jacobin but was also of the Montaigne, the Robespierre faction of the Montagnards, and Jacques Hebert, sorry. Okay, but he was a survivor. De Tracy was a survivor when he got a senator position in the Napoleonic regime. Then he was involved in the Senate's decision to remove Napoleon, and finally he served the royalist regime, and his title of Count was restored. he had served 8 regimes. And you have to look at someone else like Talleyrand, who I've mentioned in a couple of other lectures, to see this is really a political survivor. So you could say it was an ideology for sale, except in the main, he remained true to his principles of political economy, and whatever political regime would deliver that, he was prepared to support. Now, let's go back a bit. The ideas of collective ownership of land had existed in the ancient world, and Plato in the Republic, and indeed in the Laws, had argued, in the Laws, Plato argues that no one can have more than 4 times the amount of property of someone else. So that's kind of family plots, but it's governed by, it's socialized. And or let me say that again. The amount you can have is going to be dictated to you by the ruling regime. In the Republic itself, Plato had argued that the guardian class should have neither family nor property in private possession. And this idea is one. The abolition of the family was also an idea that takes on a lot of currency in the socialist movement in the 19th century and in the communist movement. Another person who had called for common ownership of property, though he does it in the context of an abbe, is Francois Rabelais, the writer of Pantagruel and Gargantua, which that book is a massive attack upon upon the different ruling elite of his time and many of the social practices of it. The thing with Rabelais' vision is that he really, I think, lays something down that ends up in one way or another being replicated, even by people that aren't thinking about Rabelais, haven't even read Rabelais, and that is the idea that everyone will want to do the same thing. There's a kind of there will be a community coherence and consensus, so harmony will dictate things, and people will want that harmony. And this idea also, we find this in Montaigne, and we'll look a bit later at Peace in Shakespeare, where he criticized an essay of Montaigne. Montaigne was a very interesting and thoughtful man who wrote all these great essays, and he was writing in the 16th century, and he's writing at the time that the Americas had been conquered, and he's really defending the life of pre-civilized, even though there were, of course, civilizations and by civilization I'm simply talking about scale, but there were the Incas and the Mayans and the Aztecs were all civilizations in any kind of definition, because they had large-scale division of labor. They were, in terms of the surrounding groups, they were like imperialists around them. Okay, but he basically saw the natives of these countries as being of Mesoamerica and South America as basically people that were cooperative by nature, harmonious by nature. This idea is also picked up by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who you will call, had argued against private property. He had argued that the first man that identified some property as belonging to him, he said the world would have been done a favor if who'd put a fence around that, if the people, his neighbors, had killed him and buried him in a ditch. This was the beginning of inequality, and inequality for Rousseau is one of the great causes of social aggravation, social division, and it interferes with the harmony which he, in the social contract, argues can exist if people can identify what the general will is and support that, and a regime can be found to instantiate the general will. And that, of course, is exactly how the Jacobins, and many of the Gironde, by the way, many of the revolutionaries were thinking along those lines, that once they had got rid of the aristocracy and the crown, that then the general will could rule. And of course, the formulation general will, you might remember, is to be found in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But there were others. Another was a character called Abbé de Malbidi, who advocated the abolition of private property. That was in terms of a fiction. There was another guy writing out of Italy called Tommaso Campanella. He had written a book called The City of the Sun. It was a very technocratic kind of vision that he has. There was Thomas More's Utopia. You might remember Thomas More was executed by Henry VIII. He had been the Chancellor of England. And he refused to sanction the marriage of Henry VIII. And we often, in popular memory, and this is in Hilary Mantel, who's written a very, very good, a wonderful piece of fiction called Wolf Hall about Thomas Cromwell, who was basically the right-hand man for Henry VIII. And in that work, she presents Thomas More as something of a fanatic. Well, and as a fanatic persecutor of non-Catholics. The problem with that is if you read Thomas More's Utopia, he allows freedom of religion. So I think that's somewhat unfair, but even though for various reasons at different times he did, in his position, he did support the execution of heretics, but it wasn't common. And there were more political reasons for that than anything. But ideally for More, that wouldn't have occurred. So he writes a book called The Utopia, and that book is also very critical of the kind of mass appropriation of land that takes place around the time of Henry, and that leads to all sorts of various people being pushed off land so that it can be used for sheep and other agricultural purposes. And Marx basically spends a lot of time in his work Capital, which is his most important work, especially the first volume, which is the one that he saw published in his lifetime and was finished. He spends a lot of time talking about the dispossession of the villagers and the village poor, and then as they get shifted into towns, and then they're hung if they're by Henry and others, Elizabeth included, if they're seen as interfering with commerce in some ways. So basically, because many of them take to being highwaymen or bandits or just very poor. So again, More was really sympathetic to their plight, and he writes this, comes up with his ideal community. Unlike Marx, though, and this is true of all of these other socialists, none of them at this stage are thinking in industrial terms, because that's just not part and parcel of the program. And they're really thinking of collective agriculture and a much more frugal type of regime. So they're not really seeing this as the best way to optimize productivity. And that's a very big difference with Marx. Oh, the other person I should mention who was influenced by Mabley was Gracchus Babeuf, and he had been part of a conspiracy of equals, and he, along with a number of others that participated in this attempt, basically a coup, were executed under the revolution. So there was in the air all these books out there going way back to antiquity, in which the idea of private property was seen as anathema. But as you can see from what I was saying about De Tracy, it's very different to the political economists who are asking the question, how do we maximize wealth? How do we maximize productivity? And as I said, oh, sorry, I'll just get rid of that. Sorry. I don't want that ringing on. That's very different to how do we form a more cooperative, more harmonious kind of society. And as I said, the examples of Rousseau and various others, Abley and um, uh, who else was I thinking of? Anyway, think is that that's not really the most important question. The most important question is that of how do we achieve social harmony and how do we prevent inequality, because inequality will lead to conflict between groups and will lead to an unhappy society. So socialism as an idea exists, note this, not primarily as a practice, but when we talk about Russia, we have to modify that, because some aspects of what is going on in the peasant communes in Russia is much more, not completely, but much more along the lines of what these early proto-socialists are doing. But the word socialism as such is not really part of the vocabulary. We can see the idea. So in a sense, the idea is already out there before we have a name for it. But the idea is primarily out there as something that's in people's heads. It's not really a practice. Again, we can speak to other social groups trying to preserve common lands, for example, like the levelers and the diggers during the English Revolution, of whom the Marxist historian Christopher Hill writes about them as if they are also precursors of socialism. But generally, as a widespread identifiable practice, there just isn't the practice, and there's no real word for it. And the word then first seems to go back to Saint-Simon's student Pierre Leroux, although the term socialist had been used in 1827 by Robert Owen. Robert Owen, I'll talk about him in a moment. Let me first talk about Saint-Simon. Now, Saint-Simon is an extremely interesting character. One of the most, of all the, of the various people I'm going to talk about, in many ways I find Saint-Simon the most interesting. He was born into a noble family. At a very young age, from the age of 15, his valet would wake him up and say, "You have great things to do, monsieur." And this idea of having, and once apparently had a dream in which Charlemagne appeared into him and saying, "You will be a philosopher and scientist equivalent to what I was as a soldier and a warrior." So he has this vision of himself as having these great important things to do, and he basically devoted his life to that. At times he was rich and he made money, a small fortune, in land speculation. He had been imprisoned during the revolution. He lost that money in speculation, and there were times he was just about starving to death. He managed to find some meagerly support, but he really lived a life of great poverty once, from about 1805 on. So living, he devoted himself basically to speculative ideas about how to improve society. And his primary focus was on the relievement of mass suffering, the relievement of suffering. And the whole idea that politics could be used to alleviate the suffering of the people. This had come out of the French Revolution. Again, there's the odd political thinker saying this, but in the main, that way of talking about politics had not existed. And then at the time of the revolution, the great mass of poverty and how we will fix everything up, this becomes central to the discourse of the Jacobins and the Montagnards. This becomes intrinsic, and in this sense, without the revolution, perhaps we never would have had a Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon is also the first sociologist, and this point is argued by one of the greatest 19th, early 20th century sociologists, Emile Durkheim, in a unpublished work of his on Saint-Simon. It's a very good, very interesting piece. So Saint-Simon then has this, that's what I wanted to say. His vision is really, as he sees it, it's going to be a secularization of what Christianity was doing. And so he sees himself as continuing in the Christian tradition, but providing a secular formation in which the objectives of the Christian faith can be achieved. But of course, the big difference is it's not salvation of the soul in another world. It's salvation of this world. It's salvation of this world by the elimination of poverty. I meant to also say that during his time of poverty, one of his secretaries, because he then devoted the rest of his life to writing books and dreaming up these great schemes to try and create a new future in which suffering would be eliminated. One of his secretaries was a guy called Comte, C-O-M-T-E, and Comte is the founder of, well, said to be the founder, he takes this over from Saint-Simon, really, of positivism, and Comte had believed that there could be a new religion of humanity. And Comte's ideas, if we had more time, if I had a whole year to speak about political philosophy, I would bring Comte into the picture. He was an important figure in the 19th century. He's largely forgotten now, but he really took over these ideas of Saint-Simon, and he basically saw humanity as going through these different phases in which positivism would eventually displace religion. And positivism would be a worldview in which the understanding of all the facts of reality would lead us to being able to build a much more suitable. No. What's required of this? You need the intellect. You need an intelligentsia. This is all very much the brainchild of a philosophical schema, and this is the same with Saint-Simon. So he basically saw the world changing around him, and he thought, the key to the alleviation of poverty, and in this respect, he is like the political economist, is wealth production. We need wealth. But the key to wealth production, it's not private property. No, it's industry. It's industry and science. And industry combined with science, that will alleviate the suffering. So, and once we have wealth everywhere, we won't need any war. And also, we'll be able to have equality of the sexes. You recall that the idea of women's rights, Hélène de Gouges had argued for that in France and got beheaded. Not just for that, she was the supporter of the Gironde, but she was executed. But her political opinions didn't help her. And you will also recall me talking about Mary Wollstonecraft. Both of them, by the way, great fans of Rousseau, even though Rousseau wasn't interested in equality between the sexes. So this idea of equality of the sexes and the idea that the family was a patriarchal institution was now becoming more and more commonplace amongst educated readers, thinkers who wanted to create a society that would fit their schema of ideas. And to some extent, it is true that the family is a very patriarchal institution. There is no doubt about that. The question, though, of what else could have been is a purely conjectural one. We simply know that we find families pretty well everywhere. They're a very commonplace modality of human formation. And just as all groups ultimately protection rackets, there's a protection racket going on with the founding of the family. I'm not saying it always works by any means, but it's a way in which women then are able not to be, and they are one of the earliest victims of enslavement and slavery. They're able to be part of a group in which their role is intrinsic to its social reproduction. Okay, so he has visions of industry being the solution, to what we need. And in this sense, as you can see, we'd get rid of war, we'd have equality between the sexes, we'd have social equality generally. We wouldn't need a state, he says. We wouldn't need a state. Why? Because the state is simply the modality in which different interests vie to have their programs and visions or programs of political obligation entrenched. So we wouldn't need the state. Now, this idea is one that will be worked all the way through the communist ideas, and it will also, the anarchists will take it up, but we'll talk a little bit later about anarchism and communism, but at the end of the day, they're both very much speculative, intellectual designs based upon a certain view of human nature, which unfortunately has no basis in historical experience. That is to say that it picks and chooses what it wants out of history, rather than seeing the bigger picture of history as conquest, exploitation, enslavement, colonialism, etc. But it's one of what we could be if the design were right, and then people no longer were governed by the system into which they are. This idea is still widely held by all sorts of intellectuals today. It's a commonplace position, but it does mean, ultimately, it means you think like Rousseau. It's Rousseau who first provides a theoretical platform for this, because he says what corrupts us is society. We can change society, and ergo we can remedy the features of corruption which lead us to constantly be involved in conflicts in which inequality and lack of freedom are part of that picture. We can stop this. We can stop this. We can see what the system is. We can redesign it anew. We can control it. In the case of Rousseau, I, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, am the new Adam. The world will start from me. And in a sense, this idea of starting the world anew, afresh, is part and parcel of that enlightened set of ideas which is replicated in various ways by the socialists and the communists. So again, in this picture, so it's about the administration of all things. It's just so you can see this very technocratic. If you've got the science, if you understand the technology and the techniques, and this is assumed people are good, and people are good, and people will want this harmony, and people will do as we say. There's all these assumptions in this which are wildly speculative and incredibly, it seems to me, contentious at the very least. Then we will be able to have a society in which everyone gets what they want. Everyone will get what they want, and everyone will be happy. And this suffering, this great suffering, will cease to be. Now, one of the things that comes out of this very early, and we can see this in Campanella, we can see this in Moore's Utopia, and in a sense you have to have this idea, and we'll see it when the Bolsheviks take. Even though, funnily enough, when we come to Marx, he just doesn't really consider this at all. But the question is, what do you do with those people that don't want to work? What do you do with them? And for the idlers are parasites from this position. So ultimately what you do is you won't feed them. You'll make sure that there's some way of making them recant and come back into being a good citizen. So somewhere along the line, there's an important job for the intelligentsia. That is, they have to educate people to go along with this. Now, note this is going to be very important to what I say later, because this is the part of Marxism that has been maintained, whereas everything else starts to collapse. But it's this idea of educating people to be compliant with, conform to the ideological vision that you're trying to instantiate, which will be part and parcel of the ongoing legacy of the socialist tradition. And he argues also, finally, that there will be three natural classes: scientists, artists, and industrialists. Scientists, artists, and industrialists. Now, as I said, I think Saint-Simon is one of the most interesting. He was certainly important. Those that built the Suez Canal were under Saint-Simonian influence, and followers of Comte were also tended to be followers of Saint-Simon. They were all basically caught up in this vision of industry for society as a whole, so social industrialization. Another, I'll just mention briefly some of these other socialists. Charles Fourier, he writes all these books which are kind of charming or mad, in which he's got all these collective social experiments, and he would wait every day for a rich benefactor to come along to help him try out these ideas. So he believed in what was called the power of attraction. So if people followed what they wanted, harmony would prevail. So people would just do what they wanted, but you get the important thing here is there would be a spontaneous sense of cooperation, and this would work itself out all through the society. Again, if you think about historical experience, you'll see there's very little evidence that this has ever really occurred once you move past a certain scale. And on a smaller scale where you're just trying to survive, the division of labour is relatively limited and not really needed, and you just don't have the manpower or person power to be able to engage in all sorts of actions. But once you've got an urban-rural split, once you've got more and more forms of industry, more and more positions of office or profession, as you did with the ancient Greek city-states, and as you start to do with certain kind of empires, then you're not seeing large scale. You're not seeing this kind of harmony prevail at all. What you are tending to see is economic necessity, or the necessity driving you to make choices, and some of them are recompensed, or you find some way in which you can receive recompense for what you do. So the question here is it the spontaneity that precedes the idea, or is it the idea that precedes the spontaneity? And as you can see, in every case, it's the idea precedes the spontaneity. That is, the spontaneity will need to be of a cooperative sort that fits the idea. And in Fourier's case, the system of rewards is according to whether labour is agreeable or necessary. So he allows for that to some extent, but it's still ultimately larger scale harmony at work, this law of attraction, and the whole issue of disputation, of disagreement, is basically being swept under the carpet. And that's one of the problems with all of these way of thinking, is that instead of starting with dispute, conflict, various interests in collision, you're starting with harmony, and then you're trying to modulate conflict around that pre-existing harmony. There was one attempt, but it didn't work to do this. So again, the various attempts, which were all on a small scale, have all been short-lived with this. And to me, that's just not surprising, because if you consider what history is, and you consider the actions of people historically, you can see that this is putting the idea and the ideal before the practice, and that's not generally how people function. Robert Owen, he also tried. He was a rather wealthy benefactor, and he tried to set up a small cooperative village in Scotland, and that lasted a few years, but Again, it was an experiment in socialism, but it didn't last long. Somewhat more interesting in my view, and the reason I mention him is because usually he's not mentioned in terms of these kind of socialists. It's Louis Blanc, who was a member of the Provisional Government of 1848, and he pushed for a Ministry of Labour, and his emphasis was upon the state guarantee of work. And this I think is ultimately the more pragmatic legacy, and Blanc, I think, typifies, of the socialist movement. So I don't for a moment want to say that nothing comes out of socialism, and it ends up being incredibly important as a means by which the state rethinks its purposefulness in the context of an industrial society. And the social democratic tradition will leave an enduring legacy up until this day. So, and that comes out of socialism, and that's one branch of it. But this kind of socialism, I said, recognizes very quickly that what we're talking about are working class interests within the context of the state as a mechanism for brokering between these interests, and in which there's a point at which you say, okay, here are these sides, but certain things have to be guaranteed by this group. And once they have the franchise, they are then in a position to make certain demands and claims upon the state, and this will have numerous influences, pensions, universal education, state support for certain public works that also provide work for those working on them, but also provide public good. Now the states had always, to some extent, done this, but this repositions, recontextualizes the narrative around what the basis of the state is in terms of the interests of the working class. And this is, as I said, don't think in my critique of the more idealist variations of socialism that I'm wanting to say it makes no contribution to the overall dynamic of actual state formation and state market relationships. It does, it plays a huge part, but it is primarily through moving away from this more idealist kind of ideological frame of reference that we start to see the labor movement, the trade union movement. By the way, Lenin despised the trade union movement. We want to bear that in mind. He thinks trade union consciousness, and what he has seen is the way in which Germany had gone from being very influenced by Karl Marx and his supporters in the Third International, had drifted away towards a much more pragmatic, parliamentary, working class based, but pragmatic form of trying to figure out the relationship between industry, state, private enterprise, and public needs. That's a whole other thing. And of course, ideas are going to be important. Don't also think that I'm not saying ideas aren't important. But what I'm saying is, once you've got very ideological alignments where you've got to make sure that those alignments are secured, you create all sorts of problems, especially if some of the underpinning ideas aren't really based in anything other than your wish, than your speculation. At the time Marx was writing, probably the next figures are the most important of the French socialists, besides Saint-Simon, but it's Pierre Proudhon, and he had formulated the term property is theft. Now, he basically supported what Marx would call a petty bourgeois vision of socialism. So basically, Proudhon recognized that France was primarily an agrarian society, And he argued that if everybody could have their own little plot of land, then all our major social conflict problems would be solved. One of the big problems, of course, with doing that is, what about the children? So you've got 4 or 5 kids. Do they subdivide, or do you subdivide everybody else's land? Again, you can see that's a pretty obvious question to ask, but it's the kind of question that gets swept under the carpet because you've come up with an answer and you think, well, everyone will just go on with this. Now, there was quite a lot of support for Proudhon in France. As I said, he was highly celebrated within the socialist movement at the time. But Marx was rabidly critical of him because he basically saw that the program that Proudhon wanted was not one in which large-scale industry would figure and in which the ultimate program Marx wanted would come to fruition. And finally, I'll mention Louis Blanqui. Now, Blanqui is really important. First of all, amongst French socialists, he had a very important reputation. Secondly, he argued that we need secret societies, something you recall me talking about the Freemasons in the French Revolution. And it's something along the lines of the Masonic lodges, only now it doesn't care about any of those questions that the Masons were arguing. We recall that Masonry really, one of the things that it gravitated around was the idea of deism, because in many ways it was a response to the religious wars. But he was saying secret societies, you needed secret cells to form a revolutionary movement. In this respect, what Lenin does, and though Lenin has a whole set of examples that precede him coming out of Russian experience of the intelligentsia and the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia, of a party being based upon strict lines and secret cell organizations, especially in the revolutionary phase, or prior to the revolution. Blanqui is organizing exactly the same thing. He's in favor of exactly the same thing. And what is interesting is Marx is really in two minds about Blanqui. If you read Marx's writings on Blanqui or occasional references to him, you can see that he doesn't like this idea of secret societies, because Marx really thinks that the industrial proletariat, the unskilled working class, those people working in factories essentially, that they will be able to dictate the direction of the society. The actual mechanisms for doing this, he doesn't really have a very good set of ideas around this. The only time he really broaches on this is in the critique of the Gotha program, which is a very short work. It's not systematic. It's just really a response to a certain labour program with which he disagrees. And you could say that labour program is much more sort of on the cusp of being a social democratic, much more like a social democratic program. Well, along the lines of Blanqui. I should have also mentioned Louis Blanc had opposed the Paris Commune, and that, which was an insurrection of the Parisian, again, artisan class, but also members now of the working class, the breakdown of Louis Napoleon III's empire in the aftermath of the war with Germany and France. And he had opposed that, and that's whereas the more radical socialists and communists, including Marx himself, who wrote a book on the Paris Commune, they had all supported the communards. But you know, that particular revolt was once again that showed the distinction, just as we have seen in the French Revolution. Paris is the center of France, and the rest of France should go along with Paris. You know, and we call it a Paris Commune. It was, and in many ways, so it's very understandable by someone like Blanc, who's thinking about France as an entirety, doesn't like the idea of this separatist kind of status movement taking hold in Paris that would expose the rest of it, or would be cut off from the rest of France. So that's an ongoing problem that goes way back to the French Revolution. So Marx, on the one hand, is critical of that secret societies, but on the other hand, he also acknowledges that Blanqui has a great reputation and he's drawn to him. And ultimately, it's exposing the fact that there's a real deficiency in Marxism, in Marxist thinking, about how power is held and distributed. I was saying also that in the critique of the Gotha program, Marx comes up with the formulation that under socialism, the principle will be from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Now that is a terrible formulation. That is a really, you can see it's just rationalism. That's just an inference. It's got nothing to do with the way an economy works. Now let me just say, economics 101. Market systems, a market mechanism, is a very unequal thing. And the reason for that lies in that when you want to buy something, you're making a choice. I get $5 a week. I've got that much I can spend. I have to choose of all the possible things on display up there, which things I like. And the most things that are most popular, at least in terms of the profit rate, and that profit rate will be dictated to on the basis of how many competitors there are competing for your dollar to get that. But even then, if you're making something, you're not only competing with other makers of the same object, you're competing in a sense with every maker of every object, because you want to attract money towards your enterprise. And you could ask for a very high cost, but a very high price to sell what you want. But if there's not the buyers. So you might make luxury items. But even then, if you make the profit rate too high, you'll tend to draw in a competitor. So when people decide that they're going to buy X rather than Y, that means any investor in X rather than Y, if their profit rates, if they've got a good object, or even, let's say, a necessity, if they've managed to corner that market in some way, then the person buying that is showing favour to that and showing a preference. And in that preference, we'll see preferences don't get equalised. That the more people want Facebook, the richer the Facebook owner will be, or the more people want or need, and and if you can find some kind of commodity that is unique but appeals to so many people's desires, you're going to end up a very, very rich person. There's nothing equal about that. Now, the state, in recognising that too much inequality may be a bad thing, might tax you heavily. Then your problem is going to be, if the state taxes a company too high, that company might go and find another state which is prepared to tax it less, and therefore locate its resources in that state. So you can see, even between states, there's market mechanism competition to a certain extent, well, to a very large extent, actually. So what I'm saying is the market inherently creates these distinctions, wealth distinctions, which are the antithesis of any kind of socialistic vision. The best that you could do, along the lines of Louis Blanc, if you want a market, you can destroy a market, and this is going to be very important for what will happen in the Soviet Union. Marx thought that the workers would just voluntarily decide they didn't want markets and they would be destroyed. So he thought that they would expose the deficiencies of that. I'll talk about his argument why that is the case in a moment. But he talked about why the deficiencies of the market, and the deficiency is in its inequality. That's the major deficiency, is that those people that are losers, so to speak, and there's obviously, one big way to be a loser is you don't offer anything that anyone's going to buy from you, and that could be your working power. And if there's no one interested in using whatever talents you have, then there's no one interested in using those talents. You have to market. This is what a market, this is what any system in which the state is not the only exclusive employer has to deal with. Either you can find a way to try and get employment within the state, or you can find a way for someone to give you money by, you know, what can you do? Well, I can whistle, but we've got so many singers and so many whistles, so we're not interested in your singing and whistle. Oh, what can you? Well, I can stack stores. You know, I can go into Woolworths and put things on a shelf. Okay, we need people to stack the store, but after a while, we don't need any more people to stack that store. So you've got unemployment is just part of the process. Now, Marx himself in Capital comes up with a theory about unemployment, but the problem with that is that, as I will point to in a moment, there's serious deficiencies, not just economic theory, serious deficiencies in it. In fact, insoluble. It's just plain out anti-economics. There are still some Marxist economists around, but it's bewildering to me why, except for ideological commitment, because they want a certain program, they have a certain view of things, and ultimately, what I'm saying about a market is, you notice I'm not interested in putting any making any moral sense of that, and I'm still not saying it's the one and only. It's absolutely great. It's not, but it is one. It is the only way that we know in which the producer and the consumer can engage in some kind of relationship in which the worth to the consumer is going to be shown to the producer. The worth to the consumer is going to be shown to the producer, and that is shown by the price you're prepared to pay for something. It's not just a wish. It's not a vote. It's nothing like that. It's just, I'll give you the money. I want to be on Facebook, and obviously on Facebook, it's things like the advertisers. I'll give you the money, and if you do this. Okay. This is all of these other kind of socialists from the Marxian perspective are deficient in some ways. There's the utopian lot, Saint-Simon, Fourier, Robert Owen, the petty bourgeois, Pierre Proudhon, the conspiratorialist, Louis Blanqui, and the sellouts like Louis Blanc. That's in a sense, by Marx positioning himself against all the other socialist factions, Marxism takes hegemonic control over the socialist movement, with the primary and one major exception which emerges over time with, as I said, social democracy. That will ultimately in the West push out Marxism. But for a time in the 19th century, Marxism seems to hold sway, and then over in Russia, it gets a new lease. Okay, so now in saying that, I mentioned, that Marx and Engels had argued in the Communist Manifesto that the people like Saint-Simon and Fourier were utopians. And what they meant by that is that they were unscientific. And so this means, or treacherous to the working class movement. But this also meant that Marx and Engels thought that they had something very scientific. I want you to keep your finger on this. So right from the beginning, in saying you have a scientific vision of society, that means that what you're also saying is that there will be some group, some elite that are able to see this, and that the implementation of this program, this vision, these principles, is what is required. And in this respect, it is a very technocratic kind of system. Now, there's other things that Marx says that make it look very anti-technocratic, but then we have to weigh up. We have to weigh up the viability of these claims. Now, another point I want to make from a different angle, and I'll come back to the science. Marx had been a law student, you recall that the French Revolution had been a revolution in which the one profession that dominated in the various political sources of authority that transpired, that evolved throughout the French Revolution, were the lawyers. What do lawyers do? Lawyers focus upon words. Actions, of course, but also words, the legality of something, the words, to make sure that the action is really covered by the law, that it falls under the law, or drafting of new law. Or so those that master. So it is, the lawyers are an important wing of the intelligentsia. And Marx studied law. He was also a journalist. Note this. He basically lived a life in words and in ideas. And it was at a very young age that Marx believed that he had solved the solution to the riddle of history. He's born in 1818, and in his writings in 1843, late 1843, 1844, he comes across the idea that he solved, as he said, the solution to the riddle of history. He's got a solution to the riddle of history. Now, the idea that history is a problem that has a solution, that history is a riddle with a solution involved in it, there's nothing very scientific at all about that. That's a philosophical view of history. And it's a very contestable view of history. There's absolutely nothing that is compelling about the idea that history is a riddle with a solution. So first contestable idea in this ideological position. I'll come back to that. I simply want to make the point also that Engels himself was a factory owner. And here's the point. What we will see with Marxism is the proletariat of a class on whose behalf this whole ideology is dreamt up. See, one of the criticisms that Marx has of the other utopians is they haven't taken class seriously enough, and they haven't taken into account that there's an inevitable and insurmountable hostility between the class of private property owners, the bourgeoisie, as they've now come to be called in Marx. During the French Revolution, the term bourgeois that had broadly been meant the professional classes, that was starting to be used also against just against the merchants. There was a beginning of that. By the 1830s, in the socialist movement in France and then in Germany, this becomes more commonplace. So Marx's use of the term bourgeois has a very specific meaning. It doesn't mean the old term bourgeois. You'll recall me talking about the bourgeois gentilhomme of Molière, and we could see that was nothing like what Marx is talking about with the bourgeoisie. Okay. Neither was a proletariat, but they're claiming to speak on behalf of. Now, this idea of speaking on behalf of, this strikes me as one of the major moves of the intelligentsia. They're both essentially intellectuals, even though for his day job, so to speak, Engels is a factory owner. But he's a factory owner that is arguing against the very condition of what he does. Marx is making a claim to have a special insight into something that is not his. Now, were it the case that anybody can understand social processes objectively, if you look and think enough, which in itself is not as easy as it sounds, but let's say that, then Marx may be right. Except Marx isn't arguing that. Marx is arguing that basically our ideas are dictated to by our social position. and our social position is dictated to by our economic position. So he says political economy is a bourgeois science that is something that fits the worldview of the bourgeoisie. So all the parameters that fit into political economy, the importance of private property, the rights of the individual, the way in which wealth making is understood, proprietary rights, contract law, in fact, all our laws, our system of government, our moral philosophies. All of these, says Marx, is because of you are a dupe of your class position. Now, what Marx, though, has done is saying, I am not a dupe of the class position because I have aligned myself with the interests of the proletariat. But no, that alignment is purely of an intellectual nature. It's not of a practice. And what we will see in the development of Marxist-Leninism, especially when we come to look at the Russian Revolution, is that in the main, what you're seeing replicated is exactly this issue of a class of people claiming to speak on behalf of the interests of that other class, and there is a moment in which these come into collision. And indeed, that's exactly what happened, because it's in the West, the working class, in the formation of trade unions, would ultimately not be Marxist. It would not see its interests as represented by this ideology. In the first instance, now this has changed a lot, and what we're seeing, I'll do two things at once. Going back, the earliest representatives of the labour movement, social democratic, working class based political parties all came out of their experience of being members of the working class. Cut to 2021, and this has been going on for over a generation. Now, it's not untypical for someone to go and do a law degree and then end up working in a trade union. They have never had that on the shop, on the ground work experience. This completely changes the nature of the political party whose basis is supposed to be the working class. And we can see this because working class people have been leaving these working class parties in droves because they're not represented by their own group. The odd person might get a tap on the shoulder, but in the main, you're short-circuited by these other aspirants for employment or other job seekers, these other economic agents. And remember, although Marx tends to view class primarily through the industrial working class, unskilled industrial labour, and private property owners, and then he allows for certain other classes, what he calls the petty bourgeoisie, shopkeepers, artisans, the peasantry, agricultural classes. The deficiency in Marx's theory of class is huge. And I'm going to get to that, so I shouldn't jump to that. I'll come back to that. I'm just saying there's a key deficiency here, and in a way this suits, I'm not saying consciously, but it suits Marx's position in which the ideology ultimately sets the parameters of what you choose to focus upon within the proletariat. So at a very young age, Marx had said that the proletariat is a class, and the most impoverished class, and as the most impoverished class, it will recognize its position, and in its bonds of solidarity, it will eliminate exploitation because of its own experience of having been exploited. That, my friends, is rationalism. There's absolutely no reason why that is compelling. It's just a formulation. It might sound good. You might want to argue it better than I've done. but at the end of the day, it's purely an argument. It's got no basis in anything other than inference, which is what rationalism is. And yet, I come back to the science, because Marx is claiming he's got a scientific theory, and what I'm suggesting is it's highly rationalist. And it's highly rationalist because it is ideological. And it's based upon the alignment of ideas. And once you start working that way, you can't help but be rationalist. Now, there was something else in the young Marx. It was also very important to that alignment of ideas. And he said that his work was unique in that it combined German philosophy, and he argues in a work called The German Ideology, and he does in a couple of other places as well, but he argues that the reason the greatest philosophy in the world is coming out of Germany is because of the degree of alienation that the Germans are experiencing, and that also has to do with their lack of industrialization. Now, that's all I can do is shrug. That's a thesis. But we could, why not India, or why not China, or why not somewhere else? Why Germany? And the only thing you can come up with is, well, Marx studied philosophy in Germany. Oh, okay. But that's not going to be a reason. So this claim about why would German philosophy be so great when it's so poorly exposed to the new industrial processes and movements that are particularly consolidated in Britain, and he says that's where political economy is at its highest. That's where industrialization is at its highest. So I'm going to critique German philosophy, but I'll do it philosophically, and I'll take philosophy from the German. The French are the most advanced politically. Again, you just lift up your hands over, are they? Are they more advanced than the United States? Well, when you consider slavery, you might want to make that argument. Okay, possibly, in some ways. But you realise these are just, again, it's just a statement or a claim. There's nothing scientific in this. That is the framework in which you choose to make an amalgamation of German philosophy, French politics, because it's the most radical, and British political economy, because it's the most industrial advanced. You would think, actually, that if you're arguing, as Marx does, that the economic basis forms a platform from which all other ideas spring, so that's his claim, and ideology is just the reification, the reflection of, the taking as real of ideas that have really come out of the economic formation of social organization. He calls this the materialist theory of history. Why would your philosophy be more advanced in Germany than in Great Britain? Why would your politics be more advanced there than in Great Britain? Surely it should all be all of a piece. Now, a lot of other people have made this argument, and I agree with them. I do agree with them. I think this is just made up. Anyway, Marx was about 26 years old, 25, 26, when he comes up with the idea that communism was the answer to the riddle of history. Now, in his works of 1844, he argued that, and you can see there's a lot of Saint-Simon in this, the administration of things. Communism requires, you've got rid of all these things. Communism requires the elimination of the division of labour, so there'll be no division of labour. The elimination of private property, and you'll recall from what I was saying earlier, that in a market system, even your talents are part of your property. They're yours. If you can tap dance, whistle, juggle, and someone wants to give you money for that, that's great, because that's your talent going to market. If you can stack shelves and someone wants that, that's great. Social ownership of the means of production. And as we said, what is social ownership of the means of production? I just realised I hadn't quite said enough about critique of the Gothic program, because the question of it occurs here. when you say social ownership of the means of production, how do you deal with different disputations concerning how resources should be used? How do you deal with the conflict around which ways to manage the future, which is occurring all the time? And we look at the French Revolution, we look at the Russian Revolution, we look at everyday politics. We see this is a constant source of political conflict, and indeed, it's the very reason why we need politics in the first place. And Marx's answer to that is that you have political rotation, which is what you actually had in the small city states in Venice and going back in the 15th and 14th century. But it's not really an answer to anything, because whole lots of projects take place over multiple years, require all sorts of resources, and constantly the next generation is captive to the projects of the past. We're going to use these resources for dams. Which means clearing wilderness, for example. Or we're going to have wilderness, which means we're not going to have dams. That impacts upon future generations. And, you know, they're in the middle of a drought and think, I wish I'd bloody built those dams. Or there's fires because of rules around burnout and there not being enough clearing. Or there's global warming. Whichever position you want to take, I don't really care. It's the same problem. And the problem is that this idea of regular rotation would solve it. It's just silly. And especially where large projects, social projects are involved. And of course, with a mass industrial society, where you've got the resources have to be channeled to make even, you know, the most simple things, cars, or Marx's day, wagons, or trains, or roads, or lights, or, you know, all these things require some kind of computational analysis of what the resources are, some kind of opportunity cost of what the resources are, some way of gauging what consumers wanted. Now, the market deals with this. It might deal with it in a very ineffective way. I'm not saying it's the best of all possible worlds, but we don't live in a best of all possible worlds. We live in this world now, and that's a practical, pragmatic way of solving the problem of the cost of something and who wants something. That's the way it's done. And then with the state also modulating to say, no, certain decisions, we're going to do this. Marx doesn't really have a problem any more than did Fourier or Saint-Simon or any of the others. He doesn't really have a way of modulating, okay, Claire, doesn't really, you know, of modulating between the different competitive positions around resource utilization. That's an economic problem. And here's someone who's claiming to be a political economist, not having an answer to it, not even thinking it's an answer. He says in one bit, he culminates in that work, Critique of the Gotha Program, I'm not here writing cookbooks of the future. Well, I'm sorry, but these are basic economic 101 questions. If I was and political economists that were contemporaneous with Marx, as we'll see, started to pick all these problems apart, and by that time he was dead and Engels was trying to deal with the problem. Engels, by the way, loved Marx. He really loved him as a person. He really supported him. And Engels is a really nice guy. Karl I'm less fond of. But Engels, I don't know how you could have a bad word to say about him, except I think he supported a mad theory, or not a very good theory. But he's a very decent man, and he was trying to answer these problems that economists were coming up with, and I can tell you he doesn't do a very good job of it. Okay, but you can check that out for yourself, and you can more read on it. So, but given that Marx had said that the source of contemporary alienation is private property, and given that he also says the source of all alienation is the division of labour, and division of labour and private property go hand in hand, got a big problem on your hands, because how can you eliminate the division of labour? You can eliminate private property, by the way. in Marx's sense, because private property doesn't mean you own a shirt or a thing. Private property means that you put resources at the disposal for the employment of someone else. That's the simplest definition of it. And it's capital. That's investment. And that's in private hands. Now you can prevent that. You will end up, as what happened in the Soviet-style system, black markets will emerge to deal with the fact that people want something and, you know, the state hasn't fulfilled it and someone might be able to get it for you. So black markets will occur. But then you can arrest black marketeers. So you can have a state-controlled system. But Marx is insisting that this is not just a state-controlled system. And this is where we're entering the land of make-believe and fantasy. And why I'm going through all this, because when we get to the Soviets, we will see that they're saddled with these very kind of problems, and their responses to it are all theoretically visible, except none of them were theoretically scrutinous enough, so to speak. They weren't scrutinizing their own. They weren't disinterested. Now, I said Marx said he was a scientist. Okay, I'll come back a step. One of the things about science, real science, is you do an experiment to see if something is working. You do an experiment. Now, Marx was never in the position of doing an experiment to see if socialism would work. So it's a conjecture. Well, to some extent, you might say a lot of science is conjectural, but when it remains only conjectural and not able to be observed, there's nothing scientific about it. It's speculative. It might emulate science in some ways, but as I've suggested here, even the framework and indeed the very incoherence of this idea of eliminating the division of labour and private property as a means to freedom, human emancipation. This is nothing scientific at all about that. And indeed, Marx himself, in a footnote in his unpublished volume 3, which Engels had published, of Capital, indicates that it's a shortening of the working day, that you'll be able to work shorter days under communism, rather than just move from job to job. Very sympathetic, though he ends up being such a critique. I think the sympathy has led to exasperation. A guy called Alec Nove, writing a book called The Economics of Feasible Socialism, makes a really big thing about this stuff in Marx. And in the German ideology, when Marx talks about the division of labour, elimination, he says, under communism, I'll be able to go, I might have the order wrong, but it's more or less like this: hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, and reading in the evening. Notice they're all very solitary activities. And none of them suggest that you've got a more efficient wealth-making productive process. And this is going to be the key thing, as we will see. The argument is this is going to create a much more scientifically industrialized, like Saint-Simon, industrialized future in which poverty will be alleviated. Because, I'm sorry, people who, if any of you believe in things like Extinction Rebellion, but this is totally crazy. The idea, and then here Marx is at least right in this respect, the idea that if you somehow got rid of industry, that harmony with nature would prevail, requires that you do one thing, and that is never open a history book. Once you start opening history books and start reading about ancient societies, you realize this is not true. That the conflict around resources will increase dramatically. Just as if you keep things under lockdown forever with this virus, eventually, which I don't think will be the case, but eventually you'd start to see food riots and you'd start to see panic and you would start to... This is just as in the French Revolution when grain prices were so high, the crowds in Paris and other urban centres were going crazy because of food prices. So, okay. And as Nove says in that work, he says, what am I going to do? Do dentistry? Think of a modern society. I'm going to be a dentist in the morning, a plane pilot in the afternoon, and in the evening I'll do a bit of brain surgery. This is completely nuts. You need years and years of training for all sorts of position, and you need to practice it, as well as the fact that the consumer wants something that can deliver, as well as the fact that with the division of labour, there's the opportunity cost in constantly training and retraining, so it would become more expensive. Also, a million problems. Okay. Not only does it promise to eliminate private property and the state, it promises, and the division of labour, but it gets rid of law, it gets rid of money, gets rid of the family, and it will be rid of religion. Marx viewed religion as the opiate of the people, you may know that. The question that he never asked, and it's never asked, why did these evolve in the first place? Well, I say never asked. Some bits and pieces in his manuscripts or in the Grundrisse, he's looking at certain things, but in the main, every one of these things evolved out of a human problem that could be solved through this, and that's why these tend to become ubiquitous once people learn of them, once life works. Now, obviously, in more fragile tribal formations, they get crushed by a number of these things. They do get crushed by these. And it's because they've been able to live outside of a whole set of other conflictual, chaotic, violent encounters, which ultimately feed into these kind of formations. And a number of these things have been avoided. But in a sense, all of these things, the state, private property, I put in the army, but Marx clearly doesn't think there'll be a need for an army. Law, all of these things are part of the powers of a civilization. They're part of the powers. Again, it doesn't mean they don't dysfunction. It doesn't mean, you know, anyone who's been to a law court and been crushed by it I really understand why you hate the law. I understand why certain people have had certain experiences with religious organizations, so they hate religion. You know, all of this is understandable. None of these are perfect, but they are powerful. Now, the other thing is, and here is, to me, this is the central brain that blood rush to the head. That the young Marx, and to me this sounds like pub talk. It's just like a bunch of kids in a pub. It's not serious, because it requires, and I've been saying this in different ways, and I'm summing it up now, it requires the industrialized, spontaneous, which is large scale, social cooperation by producers supplying all social needs. That's what it is. If it just means, which Marx never thought it did, it just means state control of the means of production, then the Soviets delivered communism. Now, the Marxists who say that wasn't the case are right. That what Stalin, when Stalin, you can find this on YouTube, when Stalin said, and this talk is, I think it's in the middle of the terror, but it's possible it was after the Second World War, so forgive me if I get the dates wrong, but you can check this up on YouTube. Stalin is talking to a big Congress and saying, socialism is no longer something we're aiming for, it's something we have. And he's surrounded by these applauding politicians. And if you read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which I strongly recommend you do, I think I've even got it on the reading list, he talks about, at one stage, various apparatchiks being taken off to the gulags, to the prison camps, these vast prison archipelagos on these different islands, different parts of the Soviet Union, people being dragged off to these prisons and made to work in slave labour-based conditions, basically, or work as slaves doing labour. He points out that they would be dragged away if they were just stopped applauding too soon. So you can imagine the cheering that's going on for Stalin when he says it. And you can see the Soviet Union was a total shithole. Sorry, at that stage, it was a terrible place to live. Now, we'll get to the point a bit later about whether or not it helped modernize or not. To some extent it did, but there's serious problem of whether it was necessary to do that to modernize, and the answer is no, it didn't. And you'll see why. That argument will come later. You'll see why. But that's not true. That's not what Marx wanted. But on the other hand, you're never going to get this. You're never going to get everybody agreeing about what could be done. And I just mentioned before the problem of resource computation, the problem of consumer computation about what consumer needs are. Now, some people will get really irritated about this. Some people will just go bananas that, you know, oh, that's not fair, or this. Well, I'm sorry. Your job is, if you're a serious intellectual, your job is not to defend the theory. Your job is to look at the theoretical parameters of something and provide a robust argument for why it must be the case. And this is a very, very big claim. And you can't point to sporadic events like in Spain for a couple of years where you had anarchist collectives as symptomatic of anything other than a momentary experiment. But they, as something that's typifying and meant to be the program for wealth production that is superior, and that is all important, to capitalism, it's just doesn't do the job. I'm very sorry. It just doesn't do the job. That's not to say that you can't make all sorts of criticisms about modern capitalist society, about the environment, about this or that, but we are constantly between rocks and hard places. There's trade-offs. Politics is about trade-off. At least it can be. It's increasingly less so. But when it's ideologically driven, it's never about trade-offs. It's about this program or that program, as if this program or that program solved all the problems. They don't. It's just not true. Now, on the right here, I've given this quote from The Tempest. So, this is one of Shakespeare's latter plays, probably his last play. It's certainly his most reflective play. It's his most philosophical play. It's not his most dramatic or most interesting, but it's very interesting in terms of it really being a very philosophical play. And I won't go into the. I've written a chapter in a book on this play, and I really think it's perfect composition as a dramatic, even though it's not that dramatic, but as a figurative expression of an essayist kind of position. I think it's magnificent. Now, one of the major characters in the play is a guy called Gonzalo. And I'll just briefly fill in this much, is the Duke of Milan, Prospero, and his daughter had been saved by Gonzalo because he was meant to get them killed. And they wash up on this island. And then Prospero brings all his enemies together on this island when they're sailing somewhere. And they get washed up in the storm. And he's living there with Miranda, his daughter. And when they get washed up on the island, Gonzalo is an interesting character. Well, he's a very good comic character in a way. But Gonzalo is really this incredibly optimistic fool. And when he gets on the island and he sees it, and he says, "Oh, the Commonwealth, I would by contraries execute all things, for no kind of traffic would I admit. No name of magistrate, letters should not be known. Riches, poverty, and use of service, none. Contract, succession born, bound of land, tithe, vineyard." Look, in a nutshell, everything would be in common nature, and all our problems would be solved. There would be no violence, and there would be but plenty. And this is really the communist position. And actually, all of this comes from Montaigne's work on cannibals. And is it on cannibals or on cannibalism? Something. Anyway, and Shakespeare is really criticising that, because when Gonzalo said this, he is surrounded by a couple of cutthroats that are the worst people in the world, basically. And what Shakespeare is implying is that this is folly, and it's failing to take into account the kind of beings that we are. And all of these things come out of the fact that we are the kind of beings that we are. And so all of these creations, which involve labour, hardship, the use of protection, legislation, all of this comes out of the fact that we have never been capable of kind of large-scale cooperative endeavours that Montaigne was hoping for, and then Marx hoping for. So now I want to go into, okay, I'll finish the slide and then I'll carry on next week. I've got a bit behind the eight ball a bit. I sometimes look, the reason I spend so much time on this, as I said, these set of ideas are so uncritically accepted by so many academics today. I'm just bewildered by it. I did my PhD on Marx, amongst other things. So I've read Marx backwards, and I've been thinking about Marx for a very long time. And at one stage, I even thought, like many other academics, that there was something in this. But I just have come to the position that, look, these are really bad set of ideas. And the thing is, modern secularized societies are so historically new. We are in a whole set of experiments, and modern democracy, it has had no more than 6 generations or so, at most, history behind it. That's very little. If you consider human history, it's nothing. And previous attempts at democracy have not been, over time, that successful. And I see all sorts of forces at work in our world today, which also indicate that it probably won't be successful, that it won't be here 3 or 4 generations down the track. But having said that, so I think that democracy is difficult enough. But these type of ideas strike me as completely fantastical. And they can help dig the grave of democracy, but as the example of the Russian Revolution will show us, they're ultimately devoid of the skin and bone and blood, that is the texture of social contingent life that exists outside of the heads of us intellectuals. Okay, so that's why I've spent so long on this and what I'm doing. So I'm going to sum up. So far, the political economists had recognized that societies are expressions of class relations. Marx takes this on board, except whereas classes are capable of divisions within divisions, which also that means classes are capable of intra-class conflict, because ultimately they break down into subclasses or classes in and of themselves. And the society, you can, as in terms of political economy, you can see in terms of class relations. Now Marx argues, okay, so he limits what classes are. He basically thinks that historically there have been slave societies, feudal societies, primitive communism, sorry, first, then slave society, then feudal society, then bourgeois society, private property, private capital society, and then there'll be socialism. Now, these, to put it very bluntly, that is a very simplistic formulation, because even, let's say, ancient Rome, when it was a slave society, or ancient Greece, there was all sorts of private property that was there. So, and that was important. It wasn't just a side issue of the society. It was very important in the society. So that's a simplification. He then goes and says, so the change in the economic mode of production is bound up with changing classes. So once you got rid of slavery, you've got feudal society. Once you get rid of feudalism, you've got bourgeois society. That's how he's thinking. When you get rid of the bourgeoisie, you'll have socialism. Again, that's very rationalistic, but it's too simplistic. The study of the history of classes shows that simplifies it. The next thing he says is history is driven by class struggle. And communism will be the end of class society. Well, history, that suggests that history is a dynamic that's built upon, let's talk about power in two ways, horizontal and vertical. Which one's which? Horizontal. Horizontal's up and down, isn't it? Vertical sideways. So when I'm saying horizontal, when I'm talking about horizontal, which one's which? Horizontal. Horizontal is up and down, isn't it? Let me check this. This is a kind of mind snap that I had. Yeah, at right angles to the vertical. Okay, I'm right. So there's either top-down or sideways power struggles. And basically the argument that it's top-down versus lower-down struggle, or that it's sideways struggle, that's a very big claim. In fact, most of European history, it's classes of similar sort fighting against each other and mobilizing classes beneath them to also be involved in the classes. So that is, you can see that if you look at the conflict between Julius Caesar and representing the populares and the Republicans, so the downfall of the Republic, you can see that this class struggle definitely plays a role. And looking at the French Revolution, we can see class struggle does play a role, and so his theory kind of fits that. But as I also mentioned, once revisionist historians started going back and doing critiques of the Marxist historian accounts of the revolution, we started to see all sorts of problems with just seeing it in these horizontal terms. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So top down versus sideways struggle. So I've said this is the way he sees this form of social formation, and I've mentioned what he says about ideology. It's the expression of class position. Economic being determines consciousness. That's a formulation that we find in Marx. That it is not consciousness that determines social being, but social being determines consciousness. Okay, I'll carry on with Marx, and I will move much more quickly through the rest of Marx, hopefully. But we'll catch up. Okay, so I've already managed to get behind. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.